is supposed to be full screen.
It's not. You can ask him how he stream replacement. All these like. Oh, it's working
Oh
now.
yeah, the
But it
stream.
only
But
shows up like.
it's only going to be that big because on your OBS it's only that big, so it has to be dragged out to the entire screen, I think.
Oh, I was gonna say just straight up pizza.
He only. Yeah.
I was gonna say just straight up pizza.
Oh yeah, yeah, you did it right.
It's working, but it just looks like this. Like it's
Oh,
Yeah, there
yeah.
you go. Yep, it should.
It's just about anything. Also, like scratching on the floor.
Oh,
Yep,
oh.
that's okay, and then you can just reposition it sort of that so
Yeah,
it's in the center, and then it should be fine. Just have to move that whole box up somehow.
Yeah, I'm trying. It's not working. Oh.
In the worst case scenario, just leave it like that because you can see it on there.
Yeah, it's not bad. Yeah. Okay. We could just also extend this so.
Yep, that works. That's all good.
Oh, yeah. There you go.
And we're still good for sound, so everything is good. We're good. And we can see it here.
Let's just leave it like that so we're not messing up anything else.
Okay.
Alright. Okay, sorry about that, folks. I think we're almost ready to go. It won't probably take the full hour anyways. So let me just orient you a little bit. So one, I guess first we're just making sure that it's streaming. Kind of, yes.
Yes.
Why are you shaking your head so confidently? No, you. Okay, sorry, so what would help me a little bit, because I don't get to interact with all of you in a smaller group setting, and if you feel uncomfortable about it, I totally understand, but it would still help me if we can make a quick go around the tables, just so I kind of know everyone's names, or that you know each other's names, if that's okay. So you want to start, Julie?
My name is Julie.
My name is Philip.
I'm Jackson.
I'm Shannon. I'm Jeanette. I'm Sarah, but I'm not in this class. Hi everyone, I'm Hiba.
I'm Abdurrahman.
I'm Emma.
I'm Han.
Megan.
Tiffany.
Mystica?
Houston.
Dave.
I'm Gun.
Nadir.
Sophia. I'm Cassandra.
Alright, awesome. So for those of you who are just joining in or might have come in a little bit late, if you go to the course website, and if you go to where the different modules are located, at the very bottom there was a link to a module earlier on this week that I had set up with stuff to help you around term test 1. There should be a PDF deck now available for you that matches the one that I'm showing you here. Do you all see that?
Yeah.
Okay, and it's called a distilled PDF deck. So I'm going to try to explain that to you in the next few slides, and at any point, if there's any questions, please let me know. And right now, time is kind of working against you a little bit because you have a term test on Tuesday, right? How many of you have like other term tests next week? You all have like PSL 301, right?
Yep.
Keeping in mind that I know that you have PSL 301, this is like my reaction to knowing that you have like a really tough weekend ahead. So I have sort of hyperactivity, so I can't really sit still for very long periods of time. So even when I'm in the office, like you'll see me kind of walking around U College, mainly because I tend to be a little bit hyperactive. And it's not like a true form of ADHD. So it sometimes makes things challenging. So learning how to manage my time was actually quite difficult, so I wanted to share a little bit of that with you. So one of the things I'm going to try to do today is give you like a quick overview of like how you can get really well prepared for term test 1 in a very short amount of time. And this means that at some point you need to have sat through or have taken notes from all the lectures. If you've done that already, great, you're ahead of the game. If you're behind in any of your lectures, I see some shaking heads in the back. It's okay. The lectures are not that long, so you can easily catch up. But you still need to invest about a 4-to-1 ratio. So you still need, if you sat through all the lectures, you need to put in a minimum of about 4 hours. If you haven't, you're going to have to scale that up. So I call that sort of a 4-to-1 scale ratio. So if you are like 2 lectures behind, you're going to have to probably put in about 12 hours of solid studying ahead of you this weekend, or about 18 hours. But if you're like fully caught up, ready to go, and most of what was said in tutorials, you're probably going to need somewhere between 4 to 6 hours to just kind of get ideas down. Don't know if that makes sense to you, but that's sort of how I approach things. And one of the things I'm going to show you today is what I learned when I was kind of dealing with like having hyperactivity disorder and not being able to sit down for long periods of time. I've distilled all of the most important slides for you. So from the 200 plus slides, some of which we've covered multiple times, I've distilled that all down to about 50-ish slides. So can you study 50 slides? That's the key point. So I think to deal with like how I study and the problems I have studying, I usually just distill everything down to the most important slides and to be able to concentrate on them, because it's easier to break up 50 slides than it is like 200 slides. Okay, so this is what we're going to be talking about here. Some of these mean that if you have 50 slides and some of them are like either text heavy or have like a lot of different figures that are associated with it or things that you need to go back and memorize, have one of those slides out of the 50 where you can, on the TTC, where you might have a 20-30 minute commute, have that open and just concentrate on that one slide. And that's, again, something I was taught to kind of deal with having issues of being able to focus. If you guys are used to using a flashcard method, please go ahead and do so. This is kind of designed to help you with your flashcards or to emphasize those flashcards. Do you have any questions on any of that? So do any of you have like any other things that you do to help you study? I'm always curious. You know, that's the way that I learned how to learn, with sort of how my brain works. But do you guys have any secret tips that you don't want to keep secret? No? Alright, so I think we're going to just jump right in. So out of these 50 different slides, I'm just going to start with this one. And I don't want you to memorize this slide, so even out of the 50, you're going to find that you don't have to memorize the vast majority of them. So I'm just going to take you through. These are in sequential order in the way that they were presented. They're all going to be color-coded a little bit differently at the top. So these come from like lecture 1. When we switch to lecture 2, the headings will be a different color, and when we switch to lecture 3, it will be a different color, etc. Okay, so just a quick reference for you. So you should be aware that I'm going to use a lot of these different terms in the questions, but I'm not expecting you to tell me about like what makes up metabolic syndrome. That sort of is a really basic level question, but I might use these different terms to kind of describe cardiometabolic syndrome or metabolic syndrome or syndrome X. So just to orient you a little bit that way. And there's really nothing on this particular slide that you should be aware of other than I might use different terms in the question, and we're referring back to like to metabolic syndrome, and this might be like a link to like having insulin resistance or cardiometabolic disorder or syndrome X. Just remember that they're all interchangeable, and that's really it. Nothing to memorize on this slide. And are we okay online? If there are any questions at any point online, feel free to ask. So again, this is just for your information and background, but you really don't need to worry about particular things to memorize from this slide. It's just, again, to really re-emphasize the fact that all of this in yellow here, packing the intra-abdominal visceral region, this is sort of the bad adipose tissue that we've been talking about continually. These are the ones that you can transplant out. So you can replace them with subcutaneous tissue that we would find here. Transplant, they have very different properties. They're not inflammatory. They are releasing different substances. And a discussion about the body type and different markers of metabolic syndrome were discussed. Okay, and just an orienting slide, nothing to memorize here yet either. Any questions so far? No? So I am going to tell you ahead of time that you don't have any calculations on this term test, so you don't have to worry that, oh, well, I have to calculate like BMI. Just hold that thought for a second, because if you're thinking about calculations and having to do them, is there any one place, if you started studying, where you think you might need to do a calculation? Yes.
Triglycerides to HDL.
So triglycerides to HDL levels, And what does that give you a measurement of? So-
Insulin resistance.
Insulin resistance, but you don't actually have to do the calculation. So we'll talk about that. I don't expect you to do like a BMI calculation. I'm assuming you've had that in some of your third year labs, so don't worry about that. But I do expect you to know values like this, and I've asked you to make sure that you are aware of them. So the difference between male, female waist circumference, again, considering that this is sort of a more North American population, it may not fit everyone, but we would still use these values the most, and we could also use values like the waist to hip ratio. So I also told you don't have to memorize this chart here. However, this chart overall, you should know like these key values of what normal health is. So 18.5 to like 25-ish as sort of a BMI marker. You don't have to worry like, oh, if you ask, is he going to ask like 25.2? That would be kind of a weird question to ask, right? Because are you healthy, unhealthy? You'll know like this person is healthy or not healthy. Okay, you are going to be expected to know like BMI values. They will be part of the question. So rather than getting you to memorize and tell me like what these different things mean, they're just already built into the question where this person has a BMI of like 19. So you know, or 20. Let's make it a little bit more clear. So like what do you expect to happen? Well, they're a healthy individual, so you don't expect problems with their adipocytes, etc. So combined with these numbers here are the types of things that you would most likely see in terms of different types of disorders. So if you have low BMIs, you're at an increased risk of having digestive issues or pulmonary issues. And if you are having a larger BMI, you would also expect to see cardiovascular or gallbladder or diabetes issues. So these last two slides, I do expect you to know like the normal health range, and I also expect you to know some of the diseases that would be associated with those. It's more likely that you're going to have to be able to address this as either a multiple choice test question or as a really short one-line question. Did you guys have any issues with the one-line responses yesterday? So you guys all did them in your tutorials, right? Why does everyone look so tired? So did you have any questions about the tutorial one-line responses that you tried for your practice test? Some of them will be really similar to what you get on your actual term test. It's worthwhile going back over it, so we let you take them home for a reason, so that you can go back and study it again, and to make sure that you're comfortable with that style of question. Okay, so I would say that it's a pretty good idea to revisit some of the one-line responses. Okay. So here's an example of a slide, and again, remember this is a slide deck I created so that it's a condensed or distilled version of everything you need to know to do well on term test 1. So yes, you do need to know it. One of the questions you might ask is, if I study only this, could I get perfect on term test 1? I say that if you come to lectures and you understand the material and only study these, yes, you can. So, ooh, weird. Okay, weird response. Okay, yes, you could. So as long as you've come to lectures and you've reviewed all the lectures and you just concentrate on these slides, you should be able to get perfect. So, lots of skepticism. Yeah. Let's see. Who wants to be the control? We'll see. But I don't believe in being disingenuous. Everyone's time is really valuable. You're already stressed out by PSL, and that's the purpose of kind of distilling these things down. A lot of content on here, and I put this up here for a reason because a lot of you would just skip past this slide and go, I don't need to know it, right? I bet you any money. But in fact, there's a lot of information on this slide that you might need to know. So what are some of the different things that might be damaged in metabolic syndrome, or what sorts of tissues might you see being compromised that we may not have covered fully, but I would expect you to know that, you might experience liver or kidney damage with metabolic syndrome. Okay, so don't look at this sort of as a slide to just skip over. There are things on here beyond sort of the cardiovascular disease that we've been talking about. Any questions so far? Oh, if you've come late, the slide deck is up there, which I'm sure you just found out about. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I do also expect you to kind of know these. This is more for if you are giving a short answer question, or if you're asked what are some of the values that you might want to use to demonstrate that someone has on a physical exam metabolic syndrome, you could use these numbers. And before you ask, if you use the more North American values like 130 and 85, or the World Health Organization numbers, it doesn't matter. Like either one, we have flexibility in the short answer marking scheme, as long as we have an idea that you know that blood pressure and elevated blood pressure is there. And we would normally use the first numbers if you see them on a multiple choice. If you're not sure, you can ask. I will be there to answer questions, so you can ask. Again, you can just use these numbers to kind of indicate blood pressure issues, etc. So BMI we've already talked about. I told you to make sure that you know the waist circumference. Skin tags, you will see terms like this in your term test. You'll see them in your multiple choice. You might see them as part of short answers. Make sure that you know what all of these things mean. And again, this is sort of a discoloration of the skin that we talked about in lecture. So you are expected to know and to be able to put all of these out there for potentially short answer questions or one-line questions. Anything that you need to confirm or have questions about here? No? Not so far? So this is always an interesting slide to kind of cover. Do you need to memorize all of the numbers on here? So I'm just going to go through this point by point so that it's clear for everyone. So if you have any questions, now's the time to ask. So we've had different numbers for fasting blood glucose levels. Generally speaking, when we're looking at euglycemia or normal physiological blood glucose levels, I'll take anything from like 100, 110. Euglycemia is sort of in that range anyways, and it varies from individual to individual. You are expected to know like terms of euglycemia, what that represents. I don't expect you to memorize these numbers, so I don't expect you to know this. It might come out in a question, which we'll get to on the next slide, but I don't expect you to memorize these numbers. These are not numbers that I want you to memorize, okay? So I don't expect you to know like normal triglyceride levels, HDL levels between men and women. Don't need you to know those. I do expect you to know these, and you will probably see these in your questions on the term test. So if you see things related to like uric acid and creatinine, you probably know that there's something happening with kidney function, and you probably would suspect if you see these levels going up that you're looking at metabolic syndrome. Do any of you remember what this is here, HB1C? Do you remember what it represents? Was that one of your short answer one line? Did you get that yesterday? No. Okay. So did you think that was too specific? No. Okay. So you're expected to know things like that. You're expected to have them in your answers if you're asked. And then the C-reactive peptide as a marker for inflammation that we can use in blood, right? So again, that was the key thing here. Any questions on what you need to know or things that... So let me ask you a question then, if you're not going to ask me. If I had injected, or if I had put into your bloodstream a cytokine, so I had injected you with like interleukin 6, for example, a pro-inflammatory cytokine, which of these do you expect to change or be elevated immediately or fairly rapidly out of all of these different things that you see here? If you understand what each of these things mean. Yes.
I would assume the C-reactive peptide.
Right, so the C-reactive peptide, an inflammatory marker, something that we use to measure inflammation levels, that would be like the best answer, right? Sorry, did you have a question, Damon?
Yeah, I wanted to ask, is it just like measuring general inflammation or linked to metabolic syndrome with measuring CRP?
So it's something that we measure all the time. So whenever you go in, you don't have to suspect that you have metabolic syndrome. Your doctor will always have like CRP. You can ask for it to be run at the same time that you collect blood.
And
It's
in
used
this high, you have a lot of like pro-inflammatory cytokines.
right. Right. It just means that there's an indication that you have some kind of inflammation going on, and it could be in response to the release of cytokines that are pro-inflammatory. Here I'm working it from the other angle, which is I'm injecting in a cytokine that induces inflammation. What marker should we see changing? So if you understand one, you should understand the other, which is what I'm trying to get across. Any questions so far? No? Okay. So do I expect you to know this? Yes. I don't expect you to have you won't have calculators. You don't need to actually do the calculation, but by eyeballing it, so if like something is like, let's say your triglyceride levels are like 200, you don't have to memorize what you normally would have, like 150, etc. But if you have like 200, and then your HDL is like 10, is that going to give you a bad or a good ratio? Like that's about it. That's the extent of the math that you need to know. Always divide the triglycerides by the HDL. So it's the higher number by the lower number. If you get a ratio over 3, usually insulin resistance or metabolic syndrome, because metabolic syndrome includes things like insulin resistance. And if it's less than 3, it means that you probably don't have insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes, etc. So you don't have to worry about calculations, but you should know what the ratios represent. And you should be able to eyeball a ratio. Because you're in third year, if you see something like 200 over like 20, you know that it's roughly 10 times higher, right? So if you're worried about that, then you should worry about the term test. You can all do that, right? Right? Right. Okay, so just to let you know, you do need to worry about that kind of thing on your term test. So being perfectly transparent about it, you should expect to invoke that slide at some point during your term test on Tuesday. You will also have these built into your question, so you probably will have to demonstrate that you know which these things are. If you see different things like, oh, there is someone who has like a gynoid body type, and there are some other indicators, you know that this is probably in the lower body, so they're not more pear-shaped, not apple-shaped. So again, just keeping that in mind, or if they're like type 4 body types, then again, keeping that in mind as well. So you will have these built into your questions. So this is a slide that you should review. Yes, yeah.
Do we need to match the type number 2 you're talking about?
So should you like know the type and the
Yeah.
so in the past, so just to be like transparent about it, so in the past I've often asked questions like which of the following is like mismatched? So type 1 and like gynoid, or type 3 and like intra-abdominal accumulation. You don't have that on this test, but it's not a bad idea to just know like type 1 is associated with this. Okay, any other questions? Yes?
What is the difference between type 2 and type 4?
Type 2 and type 4. So remember, we can have different types of deposition of adipose tissue. So it could be subcutaneous, but it doesn't necessarily have to be intra-abdominal. So that's the difference here. So you might have an expanded waistline, but it's not always like intra-abdominal accumulation. It could be subcutaneous. Or it could be like muscle mass. It could be like a whole bunch of things. Like if you've ever seen a rugby player, they're very much like, they have a thicker trunk, mainly because they built up mass, and you know some of the muscle structures are a little different. All right, so again, this is just to get back to like euglycemia. Anything in that range, around 100-ish, consider that to be euglycemia. We'll take a range of answers. Anything like too far in excess, like that's stuff that you are probably not going to get full marks on, but you know, anything in that range, around 100-ish, we'll be happy with it. I put this up here not so that you need to worry about going back and memorizing things on this slide. So again, this is not a memorization slide. The next one is, but not this one. So in terms of this slide, what I really wanted to get across, know what euglycemia means, know roughly the range, so 90, 100, we'll take like 110-ish, all of that's good. You don't have to memorize things on this particular part of the diagram because I didn't go through it in a lot of detail. However, you should be aware, if you haven't started studying for PSL or it's been a while since you've taken PSL, remember we have like the pancreatic beta cells, those are the insulin producing cells. So just keeping in mind, I make that assumption that you know what a pancreatic beta cell is. Okay, so those are the insulin secreting cells. If you get that in your question, like I make the assumption you know insulin production, pancreatic beta cells, because I figure you should all have that from your physiology, alright? So nothing in this slide for you to memorize, and it's not one, it's just to orient you a little bit. You're probably going to need to know things on this slide. So this pathway is one that you're going to need to know. You might see these different molecules as part of the answer statements in questions. So just knowing like what P85 is will go a long way to relieving your anxiety, like, oh, is this like an appropriate answer choice? Where have we seen P85, this subunit associated with PI3 kinase? So you'll need to know this slide. Is there anything on this slide at this point, and particularly what's here on the right, this side here, is there anything that you want to go back and confirm or anything that you are unsure of on this slide that you would like me to expand on at this point? Or is there anyone in the online space that wants me to?
There's nobody else watching.
No one else watching.
It's
Oh,
literally
that's
you.
sad. Aw.
Just us.
I feel like a
just
failed
three.
YouTuber now. Okay. All right.
It says 3 watching, but nobody's commenting anything.
Okay. All right. Anything? Yes.
So is the presence and the downstream effect of P85 and P10, P110,
Yep.
is there more for translocation or is there less?
Right. So what this is saying is that in the presence of insulin, if we're looking at like a muscle cell or if we're looking at like a liver cell, one of the things that will happen is insulin, the receptor will dimerize, which is what you see here. It will autophosphorylate the intracellular region, and one of the things that will happen is that we will cause this molecule, which is known as PI3 kinase, and PI3 kinase is a lipid kinase. It breaks down some of the cell membrane, and the PI3 kinase has 2 different proteins to make it complete. So one part of it is known as P85. Why is everyone typing? This should be a review, right?
Want to get everything down.
Okay. Let me tell you my life story. Okay, so we have the P85 and we have the P110. When it's activated and when it's drawn to the activated insulin receptor, it actually causes many different pathways to be activated at the same time. But these are 2 subunits of the active enzyme known as PI3 kinase. What I wanted you to make sure that you knew was that one of the downstream pathways to this is the activation of AKT or AKT kinase. And this in turn, and this is the major step, which is why the arrows are the most bold that you see here, and it causes the translocation of the intracellular glucose transporter up to the cell surface. And that allows for glucose to enter into the liver or the muscle cell, etc. And those were like the most important steps. So will you see P85? Yes. If you see P85, you would identify it immediately like with PI3 kinase. Any other questions? Yes.
Do we know like the other pathways involved?
If I didn't cover those other pathways, then no, you don't need to know them. Is that how we do things here at U of T? Yeah. Yeah. Not a big fan, because what's the point? Okay. Right. So okay. Going back to this slide again, there's really not much other than to orient you a little bit. Make sure that you are aware when we are looking at this. And now we're into a different slide deck, so you see the color has changed up here at the top. So we're actually into like lecture 2. And one of the things that we were really emphasizing in lecture 2 is that we have a switch from subcutaneous to intra-abdominal accumulation. They're very different molecular properties associated with these adipocytes. And that's really the take-home message. This reinforces like the different body types. So is it type 1, type 2, type 3, type 4? We have more accumulation here. It's probably a gynoid body type. If we have accumulation above the waistline, just drawing back like all those different things, like waist to hip ratios, like do you know what they are? What are sort of the normal waist measurements, etc. So one other thing on this slide, which is an important slide, there's a couple of things that the TAs have indicated to me based on questions that they've received that I want to go back over and touch base with you. So one, can you use MRI to detect intra-abdominal adipose tissue accumulation? Can you use it for that? Yes. Could you use it to therefore make a diagnosis based on this slide of metabolic syndrome? Well, it actually tells you. So I know some in tutorials that question has come up. You can use it to actually come up with a definition of like intra-abdominal accumulation. So it's not just DEXA scans. MRIs can do the same thing. Any questions? There's been a lot of puzzled-ish ones. Yes, Dana?
Is there like a preference DEXA versus MRI, or
Nope.
is one cheaper, or?
More hospitals now have DEXA scans. MRIs are like common. Most hospitals have these. But more and more hospitals now also have DEXA scanning units. So a few years ago you would have said that the lack of availability of DEXA scanning. But I don't think that's as big an issue now, so no, there's no difference. The cost is about the same too. You get more radiation exposure if you're getting DEXA, but it's so low level radiation that you get that when you go through the airport anyways. Like they DEXA scan you. So no preference. You can use either. I was also asked about this, and I didn't really cover it, and you don't really have to incorporate this into your answer, but if you were looking at it from a different perspective, which I'm hoping you might have, when we had this up here, this is sort of a revisitation of like the key physical measurements that might be taken, some of the chemical measurements. I told you you don't have to memorize the values for like HDL or triglyceride. You don't have to. I don't expect that in your answer. Like, what might you measure? You might measure triglyceride. You might measure HDL. You don't need to know like the normal ranges of them. The waist to hip ratios, circumference, all of that I do expect you to know. Blood pressure values, I already told you I expect you to know. And I also have told you that euglycemia you should expect to know. Here again is the third different number for euglycemia. So 90, 100, 110, like they're all okay for us. But you would have to have more than one of these to actually qualify to have metabolic syndrome. So one, like high blood pressure, doesn't mean you have metabolic syndrome. Okay, so having a larger waist circumference doesn't mean you have metabolic syndrome. You'd have to have at least 3 of these to have metabolic syndrome as a diagnosis. Is that clear for everyone? Okay, and you could include that as part of your answer. I would expect you to know these values. You're expected to know these values that are here in terms of body mass and fat percentage. Okay. I'd also expect you to make sure that you know this slide here, some of the different things that we talked about in class, the advantages and disadvantages, so it's a good slide to kind of go over, but there's really not a lot to memorize on here. If you sat through lectures before, it should be pretty either common sense or it should be stuff that you kind of remember. Right? Jeanette, you joined the class late. Are you all caught up?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So again, this is just to give you an idea of DEXA scanning used to measure fat distribution, but also just to look at a potential diagnosis for metabolic syndrome. So we could do DEXA scanning. We could also kind of look at MRI, as I mentioned to you earlier. We are very flexible in the marking scheme as long as it's something that you have heard in lecture or talked about in tutorial. So don't try to be too worried that you haven't filled in like every last possibility. So on here, I'm always curious, on this slide here, which a lot of you might think is a throwaway slide, what is like the most important thing? Yeah.
The mouse models?
Sure, but I mean, could I ask a question easily like, what could we use to model like metabolic syndrome? Mice model, sure, but that's not the major thing that you might take away from this slide, because it's not a throwaway slide. Anything else? Yes?
The genes.
Right, so do you need to know that genes have been identified? Yes. Do you need to roughly know like how many genes? 300? Yes. Like that is sort of the key thing here. A lot of the other things are just sort of setting up for what happens next. Should you know about these different types of lymphocytes, particularly the X lymphocyte? Yes. Totally expect you to know it. Totally have questions on this on your term test, so make sure that you go and re-listen to that part of the lecture. Yes.
Just with the X lymphocytes, for the pancreatic beta cells, was it the T cells that destroy the beta cells or the X lymphocytes?
So the original thought was we get activation of these T helpers that then activate the T killer cells that cause the destruction. We still think that that's true, but we also know that these X lymphocytes also probably play a role in the generation of these auto-antibodies. So you kind of need to address both. Like you need both X lymphocytes, and we also need these killer T lymphocytes, which is why I think I have this on here. So you do need to be aware of both.
Okay.
And when we're talking about these dual expressor cells, we don't really know the full extent of why we have these X lymphocytes that have some of the physical markers for beta lymphocytes or B lymphocytes and then the T lymphocytes. But we do see that we have a higher level, so that might be like part of a question, like, oh, we see an elevation of like dual expressor cells. Like I can't define that for you, so I'm there to help you during the term test, but if you ask me for a definition of a word that we talked about that I told you is important, like sadly I will just say, think back to lecture 2, but I won't define it for you. So if you see that, it means that it's probably generating or causing like type 1 diabetes, it's got these different properties, but that's really about it. Any other questions? Yes?
So are dual expressor cells and X lymphocytes interchangeable?
Yep. So are they interchangeable? Can you use dual expressor and X lymphocytes? That's perfectly fine. Any other questions? No. So do you need to memorize everything on here? No. And again, this is a compressed slide deck. And I'm putting this up here for a reason. So you do not need to go through a lot of the details related to the fasting mimicking diet, which is the only one that you should be concerned about for term test 1. You do not need to know anything over here. I keep getting asked, and I guess there's a lot of distrust around like what will be on a term test. Like I have not put any questions out there related to any of the things over here. And this is really just to orient you a little bit. So if you're going to pay attention to any type of diet, it might be this one. It might be related to some of the bullet points here, but that's about it. And that's the only slide that you need to worry about. So all of the other background slides don't. Will you get a question on the Saccharomyces cerevisiae? I think you had one in your one-line responses. How many of you got that right? 0, right? None of you got it right. Did anyone get it right?
Yeah, some people might.
Some people in your tutorial got it right? Awesome. So did you know about this stress and hydrogen peroxide? Ooh, some confident nods at the back. Yay. Yes. So you might want to know a little bit about the model system that we use to measure things related to the fasting mimicking diet. And that's all I'll say. So this slide is here for a reason. You probably just want to review, like, how do we know if these cells respond to stress differently under different diet conditions? How do we induce different changes in medium, etc.? But that's the extent of it. So will you see it on your term test? Yes. Is everything that you need to know about that particular question or questions on this slide? Yes. So I'm just giving you this slide for that reason. Do you think you need to memorize everything on this slide? Yes.
I have a question for that.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
when it says at 16 MO, is that at 16 months? Or
Sorry, we're over here?
Yes.
Yes, 16 months. Do you think you need to memorize 16 months?
probably?
No.
No? Okay.
No. No. You do not. Do you need to memorize n equals 110? No. N equals 55?
Maybe like you took like about half of the mice and did that to them, and then the other half of the mice you did that.
Yeah, no. No. Nor do you need to indicate any kind of numbers. If you're asked for an experimental model, like you don't put numbers like this. You just, I'm going to use this as my control, or if you're asked about a dB, I don't need numbers. So the reason why I put this up here, do you remember what this was? Ad libitum? What does that mean? Free to eat. Right, they can eat at any time, the food's available for them, they can just eat whenever. So I just wanted to put this out here for a reason. One, make sure that you know what these terms mean, because I talked about them in class. I will not define them for you during the test. So if you see like ad libitum and it's changing something about them, that's what it means. So I wanted to make sure we're all on the same page. And again, I also wanted to draw your attention to this particular part of it. Like, what do we measure if we think that there's something happening after diet or after like metabolic syndrome? We typically sacrifice these mice, and because we're worried about different parts of their internal organs, we would usually do things related to their heart, liver, and kidney. I've also linked that with what I talked about in this part of the review. Kidney, heart, liver, those were all mentioned earlier today as well, right? So keep that in mind. Particularly around short answer questions, what organs might you want to include in your analysis? These would be ones that we would want to see. Yes?
Do we need to know the mutation for this mouse model?
For this mouse model, there is no mutation, so yes.
C57B.
So that is just the name. So Jackson Lab creates these different mice strains. This 57th line of these mice, which happen to be black color, and they were the 6th generation that were used. That's why we get the CL57BL6J mice, and the J just stands for Jackson Labs. So do you need to memorize that? No. Do you need that in your answer? No. Control mice, DB mice, that's it. Okay. Alright, it looks like I'm doing optogenetics on the mouse brain. That's so awesome. Alright. Okay. So these are good slides to make sure that you are going back and studying. What would happen, for example, if we have too much melanocortin around, the hypothalamus being really important, where does leptin normally come from? Again, hopefully if you sat through all these lectures, you know where leptin is coming from. That's an easy answer, right? Where does leptin come from? Adipocytes, but I bet you any money if that shows up on any of your questions, there will be a small proportion of students that get the wrong answer. And for me, that's a fail. So, adipocytes, and we've talked about that. So, good slide to know. You're going to get a lot of questions to deal with, like neuropeptide Y, leptin. You're going to get those as answer choices quite a lot. So, just making sure that you know what does neuropeptide normally do and what's important about it are going to go a long way to reducing your anxiety and feeling confident that I can rule this question out or this is a potential answer choice, okay? So remember, you only have 15 multiple choice. Most of them are of the same format that you had on your practice, about the same length of time. How many of you had problems reading through like all the multiple choice? So I think you guys got 4 or 5 multiple choice practice. Pretty close in terms of level of difficulty, the type of wording, so keeping that in mind. the one-line responses pretty much identical to the format and the types of questions you're going to be asked. And I'll come back to the short answers a little bit later. So make sure that you know this model system of how we do the transplant, why it's important. Again, we've switched heading colors, which means we're now into lecture 3. So this is an important one to make sure that you go back over. I've also indicated, again, here, that model system. I'm not testing you like on names, and this is why I've included this slide. This is not a memorization slide. It's a slide to just orient you. I'm not going to be testing you on details, even if I've talked about it. Like, you don't need to know that the study that was done by Freyne et al. Is the one that is important. So I know some of you come from a psychology background where you get tested on that. You don't need to worry about that. So this is just to orient you a little bit. Curious about this one. What should you know from this slide? Or do you think that you need to know anything from this slide? So first, do you need to know this slide or don't need to know this slide? Need to know this slide, but only the things that I've actually kind of highlighted for you. So the UCP1, thermogenesis, brown adipose tissue, most important adipose tissue that responds. Can all adipose tissue respond that way? It can, but they're not all effective and they're not all efficient. So can you convert white adipose tissue into brown adipose tissue? Yes, if they're exposed long enough to different factors, including like adrenaline and UCP upregulation occurs, you could convert it. We would go through white to beige to brown. But again, we didn't talk about that in a lot of detail. But you could use UCP1 as a marker for brown adipose tissue. And it's also there to tell you that you're going to get a lot of answer choices around UCP1. So I won't lie. You'll see UCP1 popping up quite a lot. You don't need to memorize everything here. Oh, people are going to class. Sorry about that. I'll try to wrap things up in the next 10 minutes if that works. Thanks for your help. You don't need to memorize any of the stuff here except for adiponectin being an important one, as is mentioned, and then resistin over here for adipose tissue. Which class are you guys running to, just out of curiosity? PSL. You look so happy. Alright. Well, I hope they give you like a good review session. Hope you're all ready for Monday. Good luck on Monday because I won't see you beforehand. See you later. And it is recording and
Yeah.
streaming.
It should be.
Okay.
It's still going.
Alright,
It's good.
thanks for your help. So, again, just highlighting, you're going to get a lot of answer choices that deal with adiponectin, resistin. You might have that in your short answer choices as well. Just be like really clear about their roles. So the ones here in red are the most important molecules that we spent the most amount of time on. So again, keeping that in mind, that this is a good slide to just review. Nothing from the other molecules that get released are important because I don't think we've covered any of those. Maybe interleukin 6, but we've covered that separately. But everything else, you don't.
Sorry, a quick question.
Yep.
You said to convert white adipose tissue to brown adipose tissue, we can either add more UCP1 or what was the other one?
So the conversion of white to beige to brown adipose tissue requires the upregulation of UCP1, their insertion into the pre-existing mitochondria. The really cool thing is, as you get those genes being inserted, the mitochondria actually undergo fission, so they can start dividing the more UCP1 that you have, but it's the prolonged expression of UCP1 and the downstream pathways like the noradrenaline, beta-adrenergic activation on the adipocytes, then you get that cyclic AMP activation, cyclic AMP activation, and then protein kinase A. Should you know that pathway? Yes, because it's on the next slide, and that leads eventually to UCP1 upregulation. So every part of the slide is going to be important. So there are a lot of questions questions around this melanocortin, melanin, all of that. So don't worry so much about that, but do make sure that you know about melanocortin and the role of melanocortin and how that would work. Don't forget about this part of the slide because I covered this again in lecture 4. You do need to know these pathways, and it's likely that you're going to need to know what would happen if I blocked this molecule, or if I increased the level of this molecule, what would happen. So understanding the diagram and memorizing it is one thing. This is one of those TTC slides. You kind of stare at it while you're on the TTC, and if I blocked the activity of cyclic AMP, what might happen to this adipocyte, even if noradrenaline is around, or if I have like more noradrenaline, what might I expect to see in that adipocyte? So it's a pretty good slide to go over, and then some of the physiology and the anatomy of the different nuclei that are going on up here, pretty important. So there are quite a number of questions that come from this one slide. So this is a good slide to be comfortable around. All right. There are also several questions related to adiponectin. So I literally, as some of you know, I kind of use these slides and the bullet points from these slides to kind of generate multiple choice test questions. So bullet points that are on here are probably ones that you need to kind of think about, particularly for the multiple choice. All right. And there's still no questions on that, right? No. All right. So this question came up because on some of the Kahoot that the students kind of put together, so Julie, you helped put some of that together. There were questions that kind of dealt a lot with these molecules here, right? I think there was one in particular. There was a Kahoot question. Do you think you need to know this slide? Abdurrahim, you say yes. So, Dana, what do you say?
I think yes.
Think yes. Jackson? Yep. Okay, no. Yeah. So I didn't really spend a lot of time on this slide, to be honest, and I guess it could be considered fair because I did put it up there. I did say that molecules were involved, but as far as I know, and if it comes up, because I've forgotten, we'll just delete it, but no, don't need to know it. Don't want you to spend time kind of thinking about that. On the other hand, since you don't need to know this slide, you should probably spend time on this slide. There are several questions that have come up and are based on this one slide, including like all the bullet points that are here on the left. So I kind of want you to think about that. Do you remember where beta oxidation takes place? Because that was on 2 slides ago. Where does that occur? Yep. In the mitochondria. It requires uncoupling protein 1, requires those different molecules like the free fatty acids and the glycerol. So again, beta oxidation, make that link. Make sure you know the 2 different arms of these pathways. So what might happen if you inhibit COX-2 or COX-1? Yep, so it would increase these downstream inflammatory markers because we don't produce prostaglandin. Is that one of your short answer questions? Yeah. So again, a good thing to think a little bit about. So if I modify or change the activity of one of these, what might happen downstream of it? And you should know both of these pathways. So good slide to make sure you're spending time on. Be comfortable with this slide, in other words, as well as the one that came before it on adiponectin, which is this slide. So lots of information on that. You should also know the resistance slide as well. So make sure that you're spending time on the resistance slide that you see here. Another series of bullet points, so it's a good guess that you'll get this on your term test. So I covered this in lecture, but is this a key sort of slide to spend time on?
The next one.
What do you guys think? Good slide, bad slide? Some of it good? How many of you have spent time studying this slide? Like memorizing it, spending time on it? You were planning to? Just the top half?
Right.
Okay. So if you haven't started studying it, don't memorize the slide. Like nothing. Like just delete this one. By the end of the course, you'll kind of think a little bit more like me. So hopefully, like, oh, need to know, don't need to know. But this one is pretty obvious because I've talked about it a lot. You didn't need to know this slide. You should probably go back over the ones that we normally have. It transitions. I didn't talk about all of these different factors. I think I asked you to make sure that you knew about leptin increase, resistin increasing, which again ties in with all of the previous slides as well. So make sure that you know those. And then the interleukins, and then TNF. And I think that was all I asked you to make sure that you knew, right? Which again fits in with what is coming from this slide as well, just to reinforce like what you do need to know. All right, bless you. So again, from that same lecture, and we're getting near the end of that particular lecture, what do we really want you to take away from this one slide? And some of that is like what you wrote, not necessarily what is on this slide. Yeah, the TRA or TRA160 is like the most important thing. Cell surface antigen, and that we can stain, and what does it stain for? So these are stem cells, right? Okay, great. That's it. You'll see TRA160 coming up multiple times in different contexts. In some contexts, it might be the right answer. In some other contexts, it's just a distractor. But you know, I don't know what everyone's background is. If you've been in health and disease for a while, you probably heard of it a lot. And if you're not coming from health and disease, you may never have heard of it. So here, what do you need to know? Anything? So I think the one thing to keep in mind, some of these different stem cells and the stem cells that are coming from adipose tissue, we don't really need to do as much with them. So we don't need a feeder layer. So if you see like a meth feeder layer and you have cells that are growing that don't require it, you should be thinking back to this slide. Okay. But outside of that, you don't need to know. You don't need to know about IMR fibroblasts. It's really about, do the cells need a lot of help and support? They do not. Like these adipocyte stem cells, they grow pretty much in everything. You don't need to memorize any of these numbers here. The only reason that I put this up here as a slide for you to be thinking about is if you see the word tumescent procedures involving the removal of adipocytes, I want you to be thinking about these experiments, like liposuction, aspirating the cells as well. You don't need to memorize any of these numbers here. Again, it's primarily to reorient you a little bit. We get so many more stem cells. We can reprogram them more easily. We can regrow them much faster. And that's really all I'm trying to get across. You don't need to memorize any of the numbers here at all. And then in addition to that, what should you know from this slide? There is stuff that you need to know from this slide.
The results of the patients.
The better blood flow, right? And so, Dana, if you were to generalize it, so what are the key things? The key things are, how do you assess whether or not stem cells for a failing heart, what will we look for? So better blood flow. We would look for reductions in scar tissue. So if you're asked in a short answer question, like how would you assess improvement with stem cells? Like these would be included as part of your answer. Would you include things like SPECT imaging to look at better blood flow or increased heart performance? Sure, like that would make your answer better. Like how would you actually do those measurements? You would use MRI or SPECT. So do you need to know things on this slide? Yes. In terms of short answer or one-line responses, it's a good bet that you'll need to think about these things. Okay. Again, not a terrible amount of things to be thinking about. Here, I'm just putting this up because you can actually go back and revisit what TSPO is, this translocator protein that is really important in terms of being a microglial cell mitochondrial marker. That's the key element. We expect to see more of them in inflammation, and we expect to see more of them in depression, which is why I talked about it. That's really the key point on this slide. So again, we've made this heading color change, which means that we're in the last lecture. So this is the last one that you need to be aware of. Any questions so far? No. Abdurrahim, you look like you are just raring to ask me a question. No, not yet. Okay, no, okay, misreading. Do you need to know about anything here? Yes. Were you asked anything on your one-line responses? Yeah. Did you expect that? Yeah? Did you get it right? Did you use your brute force short-term memory to get that right? No? No? Okay. Just curious, did anyone put different answers on there for that one-line response? Which I think it was, right? The one-line response? Anyone put anything different? Sorry? Someone else. Okay. So if you have like midlife depression, what is it potentially related to later in life? I think that was the question, or something along those lines. You all put dementia. Really?
I think someone put increase of metabolic syndrome.
Increase in metabolic syndrome. So increased risk of metabolic syndrome would not be a right answer. It might work in reverse, but that's not correct. So that would be like a clear no. Any other answers that you heard about in class or tutorial that was taken up or asked about? Yes?
Would Alzheimer's be good?
Yep, we would take Alzheimer's. Unless we're being like really mean and really specific. So we take that, sure. Any other answers that you heard about in tutorials? Okay. Again, just drawing your attention, C-reactive peptide, really important. So I was asked a lot about this particular slide by a couple of students at the end of the lecture. So when we looked at this slide from Dr. McIntyre, so I borrowed some of his slides because he normally gives a talk about this. Currently, as a psychiatrist, he's interested in developing drugs which will alter monoamine systems. It also means that neurotrophic systems, which we didn't talk about, are also a target to be modified, so we can help increase or decrease neurotrophic factors that might influence depression, and it's always about depression. Excitotoxic systems, which is the next series of slides that are coming up. Can we find drugs to reduce depression that might be caused by metabolic syndrome, that might involve like excitotoxicity or inflammation, or involve different cell metabolic syndromes. And that's why we talked about each of these. And so just going through this excitotoxic system modification or metabolic system modification, do you think this is an important slide? It is a very important slide. So both your multiple choice, short answer, even your long answer or short response, you're going to need to know this. You're going to need to know details that I haven't included on this slide here. IDO, do you remember IDO? We need to normally have IDO, but imagine if I asked you, like, you completely stopped IDO activity in the brain. Well, if you're thinking of this slide here, where is the majority of the tryptophan going to go then? So you might form more serotonin. If I'm looking at that as a neuropsychiatrist, could IDO be a target if I know that serotonin is falling? Could it be a target for like different drugs, an inhibitor of IDO? It could be, and that's why Dr. McIntyre and others are interested in it. So you need to be able to identify tryptophan as the starting amino acid. Normally it would form serotonin. In inflammation, we get activation by cytokines of the IDO pathway. We then cause more chimeric acid to be formed, and this in turn can form this other compound, which is quinolinic acid. and this is neurotoxic. I told you you don't have to know all of these other pathways or enzymes that you see here, except for 5-HIAA, which I did indicate is a marker for certain tumor cells, and is something that can be picked up on the blood to indicate tumorogenesis. Yes?
Is that what you call like normal like cells? So like is the serotonin in your brain able to like
So the serotonin breakdown in the brain actually can't be detected in the blood. So there are only two sources of serotonin outside of the brain. One is like your gut. Your gut actually has cells that normally produce that, and changes to the gut microbiome can change serotonin, but that's such a small change that usually, unless you've completely changed your microbiome, you really wouldn't see a change from like month to month. So for example, your microbiome is very stable, and I don't know if you have like any family member, and hopefully not, or anyone who you know in your immediate surroundings that have gone in to be examined for like tumors or cancer. So usually they go in and get their blood checked like every 2 months or 3 months or 6 months, or if they've had chemo and they just want to make sure the tumor's not coming back, it might be like every year. Because normal values for things like serotonin, even in your gut, stay pretty much the same. If you have a tumor though that's being really aggressive and growing, it will change like from 1 month to the 3rd month or the 6th month. That's why we measure it. Okay. Yes.
Does that mean that in healthy people they don't produce?
No, everyone has this. Your baseline levels shouldn't really change, but if you have a tumor and it's starting to produce a lot more serotonin,
Oh, I
and
mean
it's
IDO.
IDO. You do have this pathway, but normally it's suppressed. We don't have a lot of it, and in the brain we really have a lot of mechanisms to suppress like the indolamine pathway. So yes, we normally don't see this. Like this is not good. So related to that, and there's 2 things on here, so please make sure that you concentrate on both. Here, we're looking specifically at the dopamine pathway, okay? So this is the serotonin pathway. It's not the same as the dopamine pathway. Both of these can get affected in depression, and there are lots of reasons why they can get affected, but make sure that you know about insulin receptor signaling, that it normally impacts mitochondria. We increase their efficiency, and we will remove reactive oxygen species. We will suppress oxidative stress. These 2 enzyme levels normally go down, which means we have a lot more dopamine than normal, which means that accounts a lot for your mood. Versus like insulin resistance, therefore metabolic syndrome, we actually have in the brain, we have a decrease in the functioning of mitochondria, which enhances reactive oxygen species production, increased oxidative stress. We have more of the MAO and MAO-A and B being activated, so dopamine gets broken down much more quickly, so it's targeted both by reactive oxygen species and these enzymes. You have less dopamine, and that might lead to anxiety and depression. But this is sort of the other aspect, which is the cellular metabolic pathway that might be targeted by Dr. McIntyre. The last thing, the only element is this IDO, just re-emphasizing the importance of it. You will see this also like multiple times on your upcoming term test, and I don't think I had added anything extra to this particular slide. Any questions on this before we start wrapping things up? And nothing here. I was asked, do you need to know anything from this diagram here on the right? No, nothing. Again, just drawing your attention back to the data that you see here on the left, which is important, kind of linking inflammatory status with the CRP, and then looking at things related to functional connectivity of the brain, your decision making, and cognitive processes. That was it. None of the other slides, none, 0 from the remaining slide deck or even slides that I covered. You don't need to worry about a single one of them. All right? Oh, okay. Why the long face?
Oh no, I appreciate it.
Oh, okay.
So like none of the other graphs, the slides in the other graphs
Dana, I'm going to draw your attention back to slide number 2. No one has time to dick around over the next 3 days or so. You guys all have like lots of tests. I am not. I don't want you to have like a whole bunch of slides and then start studying them and kind of worrying about them. Like literally, I distilled it down into the most important slides. No, none. That's it.
Quick question.
Yes.
Going back to the previous slide, do we
Yes.
still need to memorize all the detailed pathways? Or?
You know, I'm just gonna mention this. You can feel free to anytime,
Okay.
not just you, but anyone.
Yeah.
If you want to memorize these slides, no one's gonna stop you. So, if you want to memorize, please feel free. Do you need to memorize? No. No. If you want to memorize this whole diagram and you want to impress your friends, and you want to go up to like a whiteboard and you feel like really triggered by an empty blank whiteboard and you just want to put lots of really cool stuff on there, this is an excellent slide to do that. And you can like really impress a lot of people, including like neurochemists, neurobiologists, but you don't need to, like, honestly, yeah. All right, so I also just wanted to touch on I guess one question that came up, and not all of you were privy to that question, but it might be a common one. So how do we get you to practice your short answer questions? Like what do you want to do, and it has to be fair for everyone. So one thing, we could put a couple of practice-like questions on the discussions page. But that would mean that someone would have to spend the time kind of going through and trying to answer it. And the way that the discussions page is set up is that you're identified as the respondent, right? I don't think you can anonymize, and I've asked, you can't anonymize on discussions. So we could do it that way. How do you feel about that? Because at least there you can have a discussion, people can try answering it, they can try, oh, but you missed this. And then you can continue on that discussion, and at some point I can come in and give you a mark out of like 3 or 4. So all of the short answer questions, you have 3 in total, so it's split 3, 3, and 4. So they're designed to be able to write, to check. You should, again, I've been notoriously wrong, and I was wrong about this earlier in the week, but the way that I sort of have it in my head is that most of you will finish in about 40 minutes, and that means you have about 20 minutes to kind of draw pictures or review your answers and not feel too stressed out. It's not designed to be like you're going to be writing right up until the 59th minute. So you want to try like a practice question on discussions page?
Yeah.
Do you feel like this is Stockholm syndrome? Holding you, no? It's up to you. I don't, no skin off my nose either way. So should we just try that? Okay, so I'll have to make an announcement because not everyone's aware of it, and then whoever is posting, you have to be comfortable knowing that you're going to be identified by your Quercus name and stuff. Any other last minute questions? Yes, I have a last minute question.
So I had a question for lecture 3. There was this one slide about evidence for visceral fat. It like looked like this.
Yep, we covered that one earlier. It's part of your slide deck.
Yes. So I don't know why in my slide, like in my notes, I wrote that there would be no insulin resistance if you replace subcutaneous fat with intra-abdominal fat. But then I thought that it makes no sense because like the intra-abdominal fat.
I think you might have it backwards.
Okay.
So if you've already developed abdominal or visceral fat, and it's already sort of at the stage where it's like metabolic syndrome, and here it's a mouse model. So it could be like from an OB or a DB mouse, and then you're transplanting that into like a control mouse. And again, no bonus points if you get like C57 or whatever, but just transplanting it into a normal bean mouse. You should actually see the lean mouse if you're transplanting that into the abdominal cavity, then it becomes obese. If you transplant lean adipose tissue, even from the DB mouse, from like subcutaneous sources into that, there's no issue. Like they'll actually go back to being metabolically normal, less inflamed, etc.
Okay.
Yes. Jackson.
I think like someone asked a question, could you do it reverse?
Could you induce adiposity? Yes.
But then
Yeah.
that's when you said that it wouldn't cause insulin resistance.
Okay, I might have misunderstood the question, but when you say reverse, the way I understand it from that discussion is if you take a lean mouse and then you transplanted adipose tissue from a metabolically unstable mouse, could you make that lean mouse just by transplanting adipose tissue into the viscera?
Yeah.
Could you make it go obese? Yes.
Oh, okay.
In class you said no.
No, I remember in class he said if you took visceral fat and transplanted it to like subcutaneous fat.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah. Oh yeah.
Wait, if you take visceral fat and then you
Wait, okay. So do you understand like the major premise? Like
Yeah.
the two different sources are important, and the where you're getting them from is important. That's it.
Okay, got it.
And if I misspoke somehow, then I'm not sure what I said. But if I misspoke, like that was the major take home.
Okay.
Yep.
Could I like repeat it? Cause like I don't know why it helps.
Sure.
Okay, so if you replace subcutaneous fat, which is like just like really normal fat, but then you put intra-abdominal fat in it, nothing happens.
If you're taking the intra-abdominal fat and you're putting it into like the subcutaneous space,
Yes.
yep, nothing will happen. So, and I think there was a discussion after the class, like why does that not happen? Because you still have metabolically unstable adipocytes. If you take physiology, one of the things that you'll learn about is how the blood flow, and we get this different circulation through the abdominal system. So I don't know if you learn about like the celiac artery and all of the others downstream. Eventually, where those get back into the circulation is important, and the subcutaneous fat doesn't have the same type of access to the general circulation that the abdominal fat has. So the factors that are being released, it's important. The main take home though is still the chemicals being released by these adipose adipocytes. That was really the key, and if you can remove that source of like inflammation in the abdominal region by replacing it with like an equal volume of different types of fat tissue, you can reverse that, and you can also induce adiposity if you have like a lean mouse and you took in and replaced it with adipose tissue from an obese rat or mouse. I thought we were doing well up until a few minutes ago. Any other questions? Any last minute questions, suggestions over the next couple of days? So I'm going to be around on Monday if you have like last minute questions and you want to drop in. So you're free to do so. I'll post like my availability, and then on Tuesday, I guess whatever you normally do on Tuesday, right before a term test, that's up to you. I'm going to try to find a quiet space, whether it's like here or in the other part of Wetmore Hall, where you can just sort of come in, study, ask some questions, and then you can walk over with myself and the TAs if you want to. So I'll put that all out there. If you have like pressing questions, please put them on the discussions page. I'll try to answer them when I can. And hopefully that's all streamed. I hope. All right. Have a good weekend if you can. Do I just turn everything off? Right. Oh, and please take stuff with you. Like, I don't want to carry it back, so take any yogurt, whatever's left, just grab it, take it.